What is up, my friends, and how's it going? And welcome back to another video with your fellow comrade Summary. I know it's been a long time since my previous video, and that was the Let's Play Roma series. However, I felt that this video has to be released before our next Roma episode, which will release during the coming weekend. However, the main focus of this video is the announcement of the new 1.33 public beta release for Dividend Impera, and it was supposed to be a summer release. However, it is releasing right now, and it is available in the Steam Workshop, and the link will be down in the description for you guys to check out. And the reason this update has released a little bit late in the autumn is because the scope of the update is absolutely massive, as you will see in this video. However, with most updates, as you guys are familiar, you will know that we focus on several factions and completely overhauling their rosters. For example, in the 1.31 patch, we focused on the barbarians such as the Iberians, the Celts, the Germanic factions, and in the 1.32 we focused on the nomadic factions. And of course, with the nomadic factions, we only managed to overhaul two factions, basically the Roxolani and the Royal Scythians. Meanwhile, our modder who was working on the Saka Roka faction was not able to complete the overhaul due to real life issues, but thankfully he's back and he is working on updating the entire faction. As you can see, they're still using their old unit cards. However, once he completes the overhaul, I will be creating new unit cards for each of the units based on their new appearances, roles and looks. However, apart from that, we have focused on the Mamlakat in Sabah. As you can see over here, Cam has worked on overhauling the entire faction. Cesar Hazar as well as myself have worked on providing Cam with some assets such as armors and weapons that are extremely unique looking. So I recommend you get the beta and you check out the new look of the Mamlakat in Sabah. They are absolutely unique in comparison to any of the factions that are available over there. And I would say in terms of scale, they are as unique as when we released the Morian update in the 1.30 update for Dividend Impera. However, as you can see, most of the unit cards have also been updated by myself, and of course some of the units are using their old unit cards, but in the coming few days and weeks I will slowly be phasing out these old unit cards as well and replacing them with more appropriate new unit cards. And the third and final change to the Grand Campaign in the 1.33 update is the change to the Morian faction. So let us actually jump into the campaign, where I will be giving you a breakdown of what exactly we have changed. Okay, so here we are in the Morian campaign, and at a first glance it might seem like nothing has changed, but I had pitched an idea to the Dividend Impera team, and the idea was essentially to give the Morians a feel of something beyond the scope of the Dividend Impera Rome 2 map, which is the feel of the larger Mauryan Empire that was present in the Indian subcontinent. Currently, the Morians felt like a tip of the iceberg of the entire extent of the empire, and it really didn't feel as powerful as a faction, as a result of which most of the times the AI would be wiped out, and quite easily wiped out by the other neighboring hostile factions. However, the main recommendation I made to the Dividend Impera team is to cancel the way how the Mauryan government reforms work. Previously, the Morians had options to reform their government from a provincial empire, if that made any sense, to a hegemonic empire, or to a centralized empire, or even into a oligarchic empire, another term that makes absolutely no sense. And what I recommended to the Dividend Impera team is to kind of emulate the government actions rather than the government reforms of the Rise of the Republic campaign for the Morians, giving them interesting choices of actions when you go to the politics and government screen. As you can see over here, this has completely been overhauled for the Morians, and it has been done by my close friend and good modder. In fact, he's the guy who taught me all I know about modding, and you guys have heard me say this many times over. None other than Sergeant Meme Suraj. He has made my vision a reality, and it is now part of the base Dividend Impera game. Rather, it is actually a part of the 1.33 update, which will be eventually integrated into the main Divide et Impera mod. But without any further ado, let us go through each of the actions available to the Mauryan faction, giving them a feel of the larger Mauryan empire that's present in the Indian subcontinent. So the very first action is set up colonies, and basically what this does is that it gives you a bonus to your growth in all of your settlements and Hinduism as well. However, it comes at the cost of loyalty of your nobles and your subjects, therefore decreasing your public order as well as decreasing the loyalty of your nobles. So every one of these actions is kind of like a double-edged sword, so use it carefully and try not to get too much of problems from the ensuing debuffs. However, the main idea of this setup colonies is kind of like promoting a kind of immigration kind of an event, in which you are promoting immigration from the Indian subcontinent into newly conquered territories of the Mauryan faction in the west. And pretty much what this does is that it gives you massive cultural influence as well as growth rate for all of your settlements. The next action is a Hellenic interchange. This is another one of my recommendations, and pretty much what it is basically after Alexander the Great and the ancestors of the Mauryans were initially hostile towards each other. Eventually, after the war against the Seleucids, the Mauryans and the Greek world established friendly diplomatic relationships. And basically with this action, you will be able to further strengthen those bonds, and in return, you will get research rate bonuses. However, it will weaken your image in the eyes of your nobility, lowering the influence of your own party. So be very careful with that, as you might end up going into an influence level that you do not desire. And at the same time, it also gives a boost to Hellenic cultural influence throughout your realm. This is a very powerful tool, as it almost halves your research time for the duration of the action. And it's a very interesting feature that gives the Mauryans a bit more of an interactive feel when it comes to their government actions. The next action is the spread of Buddhism, and this is a recommendation of Sergeant Meme Swaraj himself. And pretty much what you're doing with this action is that you're going to spread Buddhism as a culture, although it is not the state religion of the Mauryans, and the Mauryans' state religion is, of course, Hinduism. What this will give you in return is rather that it will boost your public order as well as your diplomatic ties with your neighbors. So it is quite good in the early game when you are trying to establish those non-aggressions and trade agreements with your neighbors in order to streamline your conquests in a particular direction. So yes, a very helpful action. However, it does come at the cost of diluting your own cultural influence. And lastly, but not leastly, we do have the request for reinforcements, and this is one of my favorite recommendations that I had put forward. And basically what it does is that it gives you a completely brand new army instantly, and it comes with several debuffs, such as debuffs on your logistical, aka your supply chain, as well as your food production. And what it also does is that the presence of the new army will intimidate newly conquered people, thereby increasing the public order of your settlements. And so as you can see, all of these actions are very, very interesting. And just a quick look at the map, as you can see, the Mauryans just have one army currently. And if I select the action of reinforcements, they will get another new army that seems to be appearing from the Indian subcontinent over here at the edge of the region of Aurea. So let's go ahead and just select these actions. Of course, all of these actions have cooldowns, so you just can't keep spamming them. Excuse me. Most of them just have a cooldown of 10 turns. In fact, all of them have a cooldown of 10 turns. So let's just go ahead and select this request reinforcements. As you can see, we have got a brand new full stack army at the borders of Aurea, and this is really, really powerful, especially in the early game. And what's more powerful about this action is that it actually gives you access to a lot of interesting population class units. So even if you don't really require several units of this army, you can disband them and will give you a significant population boost to your settlements. So that is one of the final changes for the Grand Campaign. However, there are several other small changes that have been made to the Grand Campaign in battle mechanics, such as the length of spears, pikes and short pikes, as well as the damage values. And of course, we have also changed the icons of the culture. As you can see, Hinduism previously used to be a light shade of pink, kind of like a lilac. However, now another recommendation of mine was to change that color to orange, which is more, in line with the religiously significant saffron of Hinduism. And in return, we had to change several other icons, such as the nomadic icon, which was previously orange, is now a gray icon, as well as several other icons have been updated for the cultures. However, that being said and done, that is pretty much all of the changes we have implemented to the Grand Campaign. And of course, there are a plethora of minor changes, such as appearances to the barbarian factions, such as removing saddles for the Germanic factions, since the Germanic factions historically did not have saddles for their cavalry at the time frame we are talking about. However, without any further ado, let us jump into the cream of this update, and that is why this update has been delayed, and that is why it is absolutely massive. Alright, and so here we are with the massive change to the update, and that is a complete official Divide et Impera overhaul of the Rise of the Republic DLC for Rome 2. And as you can see, we have updated the interface of the factions with new faction maps showing their starting positions, and we have pretty much overhauled each and every single faction of this campaign, including all of the AI factions. So that is actually 31 or 32 different factions. I don't quite remember the exact number. So that is actually a massive overhaul. And one of the things that is incredibly unique about this update for the Rise of the Republic campaign is that each of his faction has its own flavor, its own roster, and its own niche advantages as well as disadvantages. And it just increases the replayability of the campaign by so much, because each and every single faction feels so different. And let us actually go on to the custom battle roster for the Rise of the Republic. And as you can see, the entire roster as well as the unit cards have been completely updated, and I will go through each of them one by one. We have 9 playable factions. As you can see over here, we have 2 Gallic factions, 2 Greek factions, 2 Italian civilization factions, 2 Italic tribes, as well as 1 Nuragic tribe. And each of these are so unique in their rosters. However, moving on to the Gallic factions, we have the Insubres and we have the Senones, the famous faction of Brennus that sacked Roma itself. However, with the Insubres, as you can see, they have a lot of melee skirmisher kind of units, and as you can see, this unit has really good melee stats as well as foe ammunition. And if we go further down, you see that they kind of maintain this trend of melee sword units and sword and axe units, which is a new kind of a unit, which is kind of like the hybrid of a purely axe armor penetration unit as well as a purely attack oriented sword unit. So it's a very interesting kind of a new unit. However, these units also have skirmishing capabilities. So it's very interesting change to the Insubres. They do have access to some phalanx type units, and one of the major themes, recurring themes you will see with the Rise of the Republic, and this is keeping in line with the time frame that we are dealing with, is that a lot of units don't really have high armor, so skirmisher units are incredibly powerful. And speaking of skirmisher units, as you can see, most of the skirmisher units have been increased to 200 men per unit, so they are really powerful. And just to give you an idea of how low armor values are in the Rise of the Republic campaign, as you can see, all the 4 general type units have really low armor, starting with the Celtic Champion Swordsman, only 15 armor. The Celtic Noble Shield Wall has about 25 armor, which is pretty much in my immediate memory the highest armor value for most of the general units. Of course, the Celtic champion skirmishers have only an armor of 10, and even their heavy cavalry has only an armor of 23, so definitely skirmishers will be doing a lot of damage in this campaign. However, moving on to their counterparts in the Senones, you can immediately see that the roster is completely different. They do have skirmisher type units, but these are not melee skirmishers, but rather spear skirmishers, in contrast to, of course, the Insubres, and they also don't have phalanx type infantries. However, their melee infantry is incredibly powerful. Although lightly armored, they do come with the scare ability, and of course incredible stats, as you can see over here. 20 melee attack, that is absolutely insane. And if you stack the right buffs, I've seen this go all the way up to 34 melee attack, which is absolutely insane. I mean, I don't know what to say about that. That is really crazy, and these guys can absolutely shred anything. And of course, the Senones also have unique chariots, as was historically the case. And the same theme when it comes to their cavalry. It's very lightly armored. So of course, you're going to have to complement your cavalry with spearmen and fast moving spearmen, such as your skirmisher spearmen. However, moving on to the next category, or the next faction culture group, we have the Greeks. And with the Greeks, we have two options. The Syracusaeans come first. And as you can see with the Syracusaeans, or the Greek factions, they do have more armor, and that is because historically they were more advanced in, making more metal cuirasses as well as linothorax. And with the Syracusaeans, immediately you can see they are very unique once again. They do have some powerful skirmishers like the crossbowmen, as well as some heavy pelters, and they do have elite hoplites with 38 armor, which is pretty good for an elite kind of a hoplite. Apart from that, as you can see, their cavalry is mainly shock cavalry. So yeah, pretty much they don't have a lot of skirmisher cavalry. They have a lot of shock type cavalry. So they're very much hammer and anvil kind of a faction. However, in the case of the Insubres as well as the Senones, they kind of play a lot like the Grand Campaign Iberians, in that they will use a lot of hit and run skirmishing kind of tactics, as opposed to the typical hammer and anvil of the Greek factions. Speaking of the Greek factions, our next option is Taras, and as you can see with Taras, immediately things have changed. They do have a little bit more of melee skirmishers, such as the Tarentine light infantry with 3 ammunition, so not as good as their Gallic counterparts. However, pretty decent considering Syracuse don't even have access to such kind of units. And of course, they do have a spear variant of the same skirmisher type unit. Their hoplites, conversely, are not as good as the Syracusan hoplites. As you can see, their armor value is only at 30. So definitely Syracuse has a better front line in comparison to Taras. And their cavalry, the Tarentine cavalry, is not a shock cavalry, but rather a skirmisher melee hybrid. As you can see, they have really good melee stats, 17 melee defense, which is phenomenal. And they have 6 ammunition, really good speed, and 120 men per unit. So these cavalry are some of the best cavalry in the Rise of the Republic campaign. However, moving on to the next category, we have the Italian civilizations, starting with Tarchuna, which is basically the Etruscans. And immediately you can see once again, these guys have a completely different roster. They have access to some elite axemen that are pretty good, with decent mid-tier armor, I would say so. So better than the Gallic factions, but not as good as the Greek factions or even the Romans themselves. The cavalry is rather weak, but they do have good hoplites, frontline hoplites. But to complement the cavalry, they have access to light hoplites, which have a speed of 4, so that they can keep up with your cavalry, but at the same time they have really good bonuses versus cavalry, so that they can really take down enemy cavalry if your cavalry kind of pins down the enemy cavalry. So once again, with Tarchuna, you can see a very unique kind of a play style. And next up in the Italian civilizations, we have the main focus, of course, of the campaign, which is none other than Roma herself. And as you can see with Roma, once again, we have a complete overhaul, but don't be fooled. It's pretty much the same thing where you have your Socii Hastati as well as your regular Roman Hastati. And the same for Principes. Of course, the unit cards have been updated to reflect the appearance of the unit in the game, as well as their pose, which is my vision basically, to make all of the units have a uniform pose that will allow you to identify at a glance what is their role. And as you can see, their Triarii have that typical phalanx kind of a pose. And of course, one of the main changes to this Roman Manipular army in comparison to the Grand Campaign is that in the Grand Campaign, the Socii variants were pretty much useless. They had lower stats than the Roman variants. However, in the Rise of the Republic, as you can see, there is a very stark difference between the two. So both are equally good in their own way. When it comes to the Roman variants, you can see they're more offense oriented, more melee oriented. As you can see, they have a melee attack of 10, melee defense of 14, overall weapon damage of 27, 6 of which is armor penetration. So they are very much, an infantry to infantry kind of unit. However, when you look at the Socii variant, you will see that immediately they are more defensively oriented with only 7 melee attack as opposed to 10, but 80 melee defense as opposed to 14. And their weapon damage is slightly lower. However, they have a better bonus versus cavalry. So these guys can be placed on the flanks, and your Roman variants can be placed in the core of your army, as was historically the case in the Roman Manipular formation, in which the Roman placed their allies on the flanks. And of course, the same trend repeats for the Socii Principes and the Principes. As you can see, I will not go through the individual stats as that will take too much time. And even for the Triarii as well as the Pedites Extraordinary, the same trend is seen. As you can see, the Triarii actually have a whopping melee attack of 14 and of course a weapon damage of 31, which is insane, with an armor penetration value of 6. So definitely a very good change to the roster when it comes to the Manipular formation, giving each unit a unique role in the army. And what's more is that in the base Grand Campaign, even though the Hastati, Principes and Triarii historically all come from the same second class population, which is the plebes, for the sake of balance, the Triarii were made first class population, so they are not just spammable. Meanwhile, the Principes and the Hastati were population class 2, which is why most of the players who were not playing with the historical accurate composition would rather stack Principes and completely ignore the Hastati, because it absolutely made sense in terms of using your population class effectively to get Principes, even though they were economically more expensive to maintain. It made sense because you're using your plebes for more elite units, so to speak. However, with the Rise of the Republic overhaul, the Hastati have been bumped down. Ahistorically, I admit, but they have been bumped down to population class 3. So now they actually are useful, as these are troops that you can use in your front line as your first line of defense. And you don't really care about how much casualties they take. They are very easily replenishable, and the Principes have their own niche for now. And so those are the two major changes when it comes to the Roman faction. And as you can see with the Roman faction, they have a lot more armor in comparison, and they're very, very melee focused. And of course, don't let the armor values fool you. In the case of the Hastati, you might see the armor value is 15, but keep in mind, this is a population class 3 unit, and it has armor values that are in line with some of the elite units of the Gallic factions. And on top of that, when they go into defensive formation, they get an additional 15 armor, bumping this armor value up to 30 armor. So that is absolutely insane. When we talk about the Principes, that same armor value gets bumped up to 45, which is even more insane. So really, Rome is really strong, but to make up for it, they have one of the hardest starting locations and starting situations in the campaign. However, moving on to the next group of factions, we have the Italic tribes, basically the Samnites as well as the Veneti. Now, when it comes to the Veneti, they do have access to phalanx type infantry similar to the Insurgers, but they don't have access to any of the melee skirmisher units like the Insuberus as well as the Senones. Instead, what they have is really good and really massive units of melee infantry. As you can see, 300 men strong, 15 armor, that's pretty good. And the same goes for their spearmen. Apart from that, the Veneti, who are famous for their horses and cavalry, have one of the best, if not the best, horses in the Rise of the Republic campaign. They have really amazing stats, and of course they have a really good mount entity, which gives them a really high impact on charge bonus. However, the only cavalry that can perhaps go toe-to-toe with the Veneti cavalry are the Tarentine cavalry. So keep in mind the Veneti have like some exceptional cavalry when it comes to cavalry in the Rise of the Republic campaign. Moving on to the next faction, we have the Samnites. Now the Samnites are quite different. They do have access to some melee skirmishers, spearmen in particular. They have decent cavalry, and they have a very, very good infantry. I mean, just look at these two historical Lin legions of the Samnites. These are swordsmen, and they have 18 melee defense, which is absolutely insane. And of course, they also have spearmen. Their armor is mid to high tier, so not as high as the Romans, but not as low as the Celts. And their damage and melee attack is not as high as the Celts, and not as low as the Romans as well. So they kind of occupy that middle ground. However, they are very good infantry because most of their infantry come with a bonus versus infantry. So just to explain how that works, this bonus is added to the melee attack, bumping up this melee attack of 9 to a total of 11, as well as this bonus applies to the overall weapon damage. So instead of 26 weapon damage, you have 28 weapon damage, which is pretty respectable for a population class 2 unit. Meanwhile, the bonuses is applied across most, if not all, of their melee infantry. So very interesting faction over here in the Samnites. Of course, they were the main adversaries of the Romans during this era. So just to have that face-off versus the Samnites, or to play as the Samnites and kind of change the course of history and overthrow the Romans, is a very interesting thing indeed. However, all of these units and all of the units I've covered so far have had a complete and thorough visual update, and of course this video would take extremely long if I was to go into each and every single unit and to explain each and every single new asset that has been added to the game by Cam, Semen, Q Sartorius, Demosthenes, myself. Of course it would take forever, so obviously I'm not going to do that, but you guys can get the public beta for yourself and test it out for yourself and enjoy the campaign for yourself. However, moving on to the final category, which is the Nuragic category, which is pretty much the Sardinians, we have the Aioli. And straight off the bat, you can notice once again a completely different kind of a roster. And when I say different, I basically mean the ratio of the kind of units available. You can see very heavy missile emphasis, very low cavalry emphasis. In fact, they have only 2 cavalry options. This is their noble cavalry, and it has only an armor of 13, so it's absolutely pointless in my opinion. I mean, you can get it if you want to, but once again, it's absolutely pointless, and it will only be useful in chasing down enemies that are already broken and fleeing from the battlefield. But in a cavalry to cavalry engagement, these guys will get absolutely shredded. They are by far the worst cavalry option available in the campaign. Of course, they have an access to a skirmisher type cavalry, and even as a skirmisher type cavalry, it's only 100 men, so you can see pretty weak in terms of cavalry. And to complement the matter, in order to get access to these very low tier cavalry in terms of stats, you have to unlock the stable level 4. So basically tier 4 stables, which requires a lot of technological investment. And pretty much what this is focusing you to do is to focus on the infantry side of the Sardinians. And when it comes to infantry, you can see they have a lot of options. However, what makes these units unique is that all of their units, with the exception of course of their phalanx units, have not only the guerrilla tactic deployment, but they also have the stock ability as well as snipe ability for the skirmisher units, in which they can remain hidden while firing. So it's a very hit and run tactic kind of a faction, and a very unique kind of faction. In fact, when I played against them, it was really hard to mount up a defense because I had absolutely no idea from which direction these guys are going to attack me from. So that is pretty much all of the roster changes when it comes to the Rise of the Republic. Keep in mind, of course, even every single AI faction has been updated in this campaign. And now, without any further ado, let us hop right into the campaign map, and I will explain some of the other changes that have been carried out in this 1.33 update. Alright, so here we are in the campaign, and as you can see, I have created a brand new campaign map for the Rise of the Republic absolutely from scratch, copying the style of the Divide et Impera Grand Campaign map with, of course, the terrain features, the trails, the roads, and of course, you know, the sea as well as the effects of the sea, a lot of, and of course the clearer province names. And that absolutely took me 3 weeks to make, so it's not at all an easy task, but I have pulled it off. And of course, most of you who have played with a personal submod for the Rise of the Republic for Divide et Impera, which is Ab Urbe Condita, created by Sergeant Meme Suraj, myself. We have a couple of new members who are contributing as well, such as Lols and several others. That is not the official Divide et Impera mod for the Rise of the Republic. This update is the official Divide et Impera Rise of the Republic mod. And that is why Ab Urbe Condita has taken a break from modding, because we're kind of waiting to see the final outcome of this update without having to work on a lot of things and then having to rework due to any changes made to the base version once the 1.33 public beta is integrated with the Divide et Impera mod. However, some of the other changes that you might notice in the campaign itself is that we don't have AOR units, and they might be slowly added into the campaign. However, we do have access to mercenary units. Apart from that, I have gone ahead and changed some building icons for unique buildings such as the Capitoline Hill building, as well as the port of Carthage itself down south over here in Carthago. Carthage itself is not a playable faction. However, each and every single AI faction, as I mentioned before, have unique rosters. So you have the Italic tribes over here in the Apennine mountain range. They have very unique rosters in comparison to the Samnites. Of course, you have the Yapijes, who are basically the tribes that gave Taras a lot of competition in Calabria, and they have a completely unique roster with completely unique unit cards, and I have made a lot of unit cards for this update. Pretty much most of the 31 factions have absolutely new unique unit cards. And then of course we have the Ligurians, which are the other major Gallic or Celtic tribe in the northwest of the Italian peninsula. They have a completely unique roster in comparison to the Insubres as well as the Senones, and their roster is kind of like a mixture of the two, as well as a combination of some Iberian influences, since historically they were influenced by Iberian factions. And of course the Nuragics have their own rosters, the Etruscans to the north. In fact, even really up here in the north in Reykjavik, you have different rosters, so it's a very interesting and fleshed out campaign. In fact, most of you, including myself, have the tendency to play your initial battles because you want to min-max your casualties and your damage inflicted so that you can have a strong mid to late game in which you will most likely auto-resolve most of your battles because you're just that powerful and you don't really care about losses you take. But with this Rise of the Republic campaign, I do strongly recommend to play each and every single ones of your battles, at least the battles, if not the sieges. And that is because each and every single faction plays and feels completely different, so you will be faced with a multitude of enemies with different fighting styles. So it's really interesting to play each and every single battle, because if you fight against the Latin tribes, they fight differently in comparison to the Samnites, who fight differently in comparison to the Greek Tarentines, who fight differently when compared to the Greek Syracusaeans, who fight differently, of course, when compared to the Carthaginians, the Gallic tribes, the Etruscans, and the list goes on. So it's very unique, and I do recommend playing against each and every single faction at least a couple of battles, just so you understand how unique each faction plays. And before I go ahead and end this video, because I pretty much covered all of the different features added to the 1.33 public beta, I want to conclude by saying that Ab Urbe Condita is a personal and not an official Divide et Impera submod. I know there has been a lot of confusion because the modders working on it are the same modders who assist the Divide et Impera team, and the two main ways to look at the differences between the two mods is that while Divide et Impera has a completely different approach to modding, which I totally agree with, and their approach is really minimal, so they don't do a lot of changes, they don't add a lot of features like AOR units, reforms. There are no reforms in this campaign, no newly unlocked factions and so forth, no new mechanics. They really focus on giving a more of a complete overhaul, a completely finished product, even though it is not very fleshed out, right? So basically each and every single faction has been overhauled in a span of 3 to 4 months. That is absolutely insane, and the game kind of feels complete when they do it this way. Of course, in the future they might plan to add some more depth to each of these factions, and eventually each of these factions will be more fleshed out, similar to the Grand Campaign. Most of you guys didn't have a feeling that the Morians were incomplete, and then once we updated the Morians, you just felt that the faction was way more fleshed out. Similar with the Mamlakat and Saba, in this patch you will feel that the faction is more fleshed out. However, it wasn't absolutely unplayable before this update. So that is their approach. They want to have a overall good experience where all of the factions feel on power and kind of complete, and then slowly they start to overhaul and give depth to each of the factions one by one. However, when it comes to Ab Urbe Condita, we are a lot more ambitious. We try to overhaul factions one by one. As you can see, currently we have overhauled Roma as well as the Etruscan Tarchuna, but we haven't touched any of the other factions nor the AI factions, and eventually we will be going through all of those factions. Our next update, we are trying to focus on the Samnites, the Tarentines, as well as even unlocking Carthago as a playable faction. And apart from that, we are looking to add very new interesting mechanics for the recruitment of Socii troops, which will kind of force Roma to play with their allies rather than outright conquering every settlement. They will be kind of forced to create kind of like satrapies, basically allies, as the Romans called it, which was the Roman alliance system. And through these allies, they will get access to their Socii troops, since pretty much that's what the Socii were. They were allied troops. However, I'm getting ahead of myself. We haven't really achieved any of this, so don't get your hopes up. We are going to try to make this a reality, and when it becomes a reality, it will be playable, of course, for you guys. However, that is the main difference between our method of modding and the Divide et Impera method of modding. And the main reason the Divide et Impera team does this is not just for the complete feel of their releases, but also for the stability, because the more ambitious your modding project is, the more likely there will be a lot of bugs, a lot of glitches that could make the game feel unplayable. For those of you who have seen my own Ab Urbe Condita playthrough, you will notice that I kind of killed the Samnites before 10 battles against them, and therefore I was not able to access the final Manipular Legion reform. So, that's a bit of a glitch or a short-sightedness, which we have corrected, by the way. But these sort of issues will not be present in Divide et Impera releases. So pretty much that's all I have to say. And before I conclude this video, I want to give a shout out to all of the modders who have worked really hard to make this update a reality. And I want to thank Cesar Hazar, and I'm really happy that he's able to sort out his real life issues and come back to the modding. I want to thank him for his work on the Saka faction, as well as the the Arabian Mamlakatin Saba faction. And speaking of the Saba faction, Cam has also done a lot of work. I would like to thank him for that. And when it comes to the Rise of the Republic campaign, there were three main modders, basically Semen and Q Sartorius, who worked tirelessly on the barbarian factions, as well as the Italic tribes and the Italic civilizations. Meanwhile, Demosthenes has worked on the Greek factions of Syracuse, as well as the Tarentines. And of course, I would like to thank Sergeant Meme Suraj for his new government actions for the Mauryan faction. And, I would also like to maybe pat myself on the back for creating this absolutely beautiful map, as well as working on a multitude of unit cards. I think in the past 3 to 4 months, I've worked on at least 500 unit cards. And that is really an understatement. And, I can actually do a lot more if people like you reach out to me and offered your help. It's not really hard to do unit cards. It's just a little bit time consuming. So let's say each faction has 10 units, and if I have 10 people to help me with 10 factions, then I can pretty much do it in in 10% of the time it would take for me to do it. And I can focus on more, complicated modding tasks, as well as, of course, releasing videos for my YouTube channels more frequently. However, lastly but not leastly, I would like to thank the big man himself, Dresden, for allowing us to add even more file size to the Dividend Empire submod, and of course for overseeing all of the changes and compiling it in a seamless fashion into the main mod. And of course, he is a great leader of the Dividend Empire team. He's a very, very kind, approachable and friendly person. And if it wasn't for him, this entire vision wouldn't be possible. And this guy has been sticking around with Dividend Empire for over a decade now. So huge shout out for him for, putting in, of course, the most work for this mod to be a reality. And with that, I am going to end the video. So thank you all for watching. Hope you all enjoyed it. And if you liked the video, then like the video. And don't forget to subscribe if you're interested for more. Peace and love.